yield to the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our witnesses. I'm glad to be back for our first hearing of 2024. In the words of Yogi Berra, it's like deja vu all over again. Once again, for at least the fifth time in this Congress, our colleagues across the aisle have gathered us here to discuss how the Biden administration needs to do more for the offshore oil and gas industry. Not for the first time, not for the second time, not for the third time or fourth time, but for the fifth time. At today's hearing, we'll hear about how the Biden administration's plan to ramp down offshore oil and gas leasing is hurting our, quote, energy security and economic futures. But notably absent from those arguments are whose security and whose economic futures. Oil and gas companies already control more than 12 million acres of federal waters in the Gulf of Mexico. Over 75% of the lease industry holds remain unused. To my disappointment, it's clear that we will be locked into decades more of oil and gas development, and the United States is already, including under the Biden administration, producing record amounts of oil. Oil and gas production continues to climb in the Gulf of Mexico already, but rather than Americans seeing lower energy prices, as has been the argument, job creation, as has been the argument, or, quote, energy independence, as has been the argument, all we see is increasing profits for oil companies, price volatility for consumers, declining industry jobs, increasing layoffs, and public health and safety crises exactly in the communities where the production is happening. For years now, we've seen the industry lay off its oil and gas workforce. In just the last 6 years, we've seen over 700,000 oil and gas workers leaving the industry due to drastically declining wages and uncertain futures. At the same time, the same oil and gas companies are doling out million-dollar bonuses to their CEOs, spending billions of dollars in stock buybacks to artificially pump up the stock price, and raising dividends for mostly already wealthy shareholders. Meanwhile, the industry's social and environmental impacts are left out of the conversation. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, offshore oil and gas accounts for nearly 20% of carbon emissions from federal lands and waters. And my colleagues across the aisle argue that offshore drilling in the Gulf is cleaner and safer than abroad. But as my colleague Mr. Huffman likes to say, that's like arguing filtered cigarettes won't cause cancer. We're already living with the dangerous consequences of our reliance on fossil fuels. Just last week, the United Nations released its annual economic outlook for 2024, and in it, economists warn that the climate crisis and extreme weather as a result of oil and gas production are expected to disrupt global food production and exacerbate economic instability around the world. Communities along the Gulf Coast must constantly grapple with the consequences of oil spills, air and water pollution, land loss, and displacement. The relentless pursuit of profit has led to the degradation of our resources, jeopardizing the health and well-being of American citizens. Again, we must ask, who is the offshore oil and gas industry serving, and who is it leaving behind? It's time we ramp down and phase out fossil fuel production on federal lands and waters. It's necessary to stave off the worst impacts of the climate crisis and create a more equitable future where everyone has the right to live free from pollution. Our coastal communities can transition in a way that supports jobs and cleans up the environment. Ports are already supporting the offshore wind industry with more opportunities to come. The policies we debate here can help or hinder that transition. We must make sure our federal waters are part of the climate solution instead of the climate problem. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I am going to now yield to the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Westerman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stallburn. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today.
Mr. Grothman for his 5 minutes.
Hope I got the right one here. Good. A couple questions. We'll start with Ms. Gentles or Dr. Malkus, who wants to jump in here. What's been going on with math scores in this country over the last 40 years, say?
over the long trajectory, math scores have been going up depending on the test you're looking at. The long-term trend from NAEP is a great measure of basic skills. They've been trending up until about 2012. At that point, we sort of hit the zenith. You can see this in a number of scores. In the aftermath, they started to decline a little bit. When the pandemic hit, they fell dramatically. I think it's important to note how they fell. They fell on average, but the students that were scoring sort of at the higher end of the spectrum, at the 90th percentile and the 75th percentile, those students did not suffer dramatically over the pandemic. Their scores came down. The students in the lower end of the spectrum, 10th percentile, 25th percentile, the floor fell out on their scores. If this was more even, what we would have is achievement gaps fixed, but everyone losing math progress, lower achievement than previous years. What we have is both lower achievement and larger achievement gaps.
So people are not doing as well in certain groups. In Wisconsin, which is the state I know best, probably the district with the largest share of people of color, students of color, is the city of Milwaukee. And we spend substantially more per pupil in the city of Milwaukee than almost every other school district in the state. Nevertheless, we get people running down the city of Milwaukee schools saying that you can't succeed or they're somehow inferior to other schools. Do you think it has a negative impact on students if they're constantly told their schools, particularly when it's not true, that their schools are underfunded or implying that they're less funded than other schools?
I think that there's a problem with constantly denigrating education, and I'm sure we can all agree that we don't want to be here to denigrate K-12.
I guess what I'm trying to get at here is there are people who imply that it's expected, I guess, or this is the reason why people of certain demographics don't do as well. Now, it's irritating enough that we actually spend more on those schools, but do you think when we talk about how we're down on people of certain demographics, it causes any defeatism in those students?
Well, we certainly don't want to have the bigotry of low expectations, something that we heard a lot during the Bush administration, that there were efforts underway to put that in the past, but certainly we have that again now that we're using the pandemic as an excuse for low performance among low-income students in particular. So we don't want to tell families from particular areas or particular backgrounds that they cannot achieve, that their students should not be expected to achieve.
Next question. I think part of this DEI stuff, insofar as we insert it in younger children, implies that if you're not of European ancestry, you're not going to do as well in this country. Now, from what I read, at least economically, people from Asia, being Indian, subcontinent, Chinese, Filipino, Cuban, even Nigerian, I think at least, I believe, I'm not sure about Nigerian, but I think, are doing better than Americans of European ancestry. Is this part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum? Are young people being taught how well people from non-European backgrounds, from China or Philippines, for India, are doing? Are you aware? Is that part of the curriculum?
That doesn't sound like something that would be part of curriculum, but we should be clear that even relatively affluent U.S. students do not score as high on math as average performing students in places like Japan or South Korea or Hong Kong. So all of our students are struggling.
Okay, I guess the point I'm trying to get to, are students from backgrounds, non-European backgrounds, doing better than average Americans? And are young people being taught that, or are they being taught how we're being too unfairly good to Americans whose ancestry around here goes back decades?
quite honestly, I'm not sure about the curriculum and contents in DEI indications. There's quite a number of differences between different groups, and my fear is that most of the curriculum is insufficiently demanding of students of European ancestry or what other group that we have of them to deal with the particulars of those arguments.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I don't know what I just heard right now, but I think when we talk about students of a certain demographic, you know, as a woman of a certain demographic, I would be happy to illuminate some of the disparities and discrepancies that we're talking about here. In fact, I wonder if any of my colleagues, anyone here, can articulate in this discussion of absenteeism. We say, you know, people aren't showing up to school anymore. It's because they don't. There's an insinuation that it's because people don't want to go, or there's a different attitude. But do we actually know what one of the leading causes of school absenteeism is? Asthma. Asthma. I represent the Bronx. I represent kids whose only meal that they'll eat in an entire day will be from school. I represent kids whose the cleanest air that they'll breathe in their entire day, maybe if they're lucky, will be from their school. That the safest place that they will be in a day will be their school. And so when we come here, we talk about schools. But if you close your eyes and put yourself in a classroom of someone else's district, you'll see that the challenges are different here. So this is not about what we're teaching about European versus non-European descent. This is about the fact that the Bronx has one of the highest childhood asthma rates in the country. And climate curriculum, and when we talk about the importance of having clean air and clean water, it has a direct outcome on people's scholastic performance. So if, as we transition in this time of a pandemic, a respiratory disease, and we wonder why one of the highest childhood asthma rate geographic zones in the country is struggling with absenteeism, knowing that respiratory disease is a major factor in that, maybe we try to solve that problem. Maybe we take a look at some of the environmental and some of the economic factors in getting to a school. Ms. Fort, you have extensive experience in this issue. Can you speak a little bit towards some of those economic and environmental factors that you see and how they affect communities and their ability to navigate educational outcomes?
It was green. Thank you for that question. At the Education Trust, particularly when you think about the pandemic, the research is clearly there that what impacted our students was healthcare, loss of employment of their families, the lack of technology accessibility, and this really had an impact on their livelihood, which of course had an impact on their school day. And as Representative Ocasio-Cortez pointed out, for many of these students, where they actually are supported best, where they are being able to take advantage of services and the supports that they need to actually succeed in school is at school, which we believe is the right place for many of these services. In addition, we know that lack of mental health supports that they faced during the pandemic needed to be supplemented while at school. And so we are happy to see from this recent investment of the American Rescue Plan, the significant investment in schools that helped schools reopen, that made sure teachers had the supports that they needed, and most of all, made sure that more children had support for mental health services.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ford. And this correlates with what we've seen, not just in the Bronx, but across the country. We saw admissions, mental health admissions of children that were highly disruptive. Their ability to be healthy is what can determine whether they show up to school and how well they do in school. On top of that, when we talk about social issues and when people want to critique social inclusion in schools, housing, as you mentioned, is a core underlying factor in how well someone does in school. If you don't have a home or a bed to lay your head on, how are you going to perform well in school? And when we talk about inclusion and those issues, one of the highest rates of childhood homelessness and one of the highest contributors and factors is if they're LGBT. Because if they go home to a place that will kick them out of their house because they are gay or trans or queer, how can we imagine them doing well in school? And so if school isn't safe for them, if home isn't safe for them, and if we allow a culture that continues to marginalize LGBT people to the point that their existence can't even be affirmed in school, how can we expect them to do well? And with that, I yield back.
And we'll start with the Vice Ranking Member of the Oversight Committee, and we'll go to
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Ranking Member Raskin. I think the Ranking Member stated it completely. What we just witnessed over the last hour was, I think, a deep-sea fishing expedition because the Republican case has completely fallen apart over the last several weeks. After it's been exposed that the critical, one of their most key pieces of information was based on a source that was in communication with Russian intelligence, they are now trying to scramble to find anything to substantiate their fairy tale, is what we should call this. But I think more disturbingly, what we are seeing is just a complete and inappropriate expedition into the president's son, and for matters and subjects that are completely unrelated to an impeachment investigation. And I think it is extremely disturbing to see the lack of professionalism, the lack of grounding, and the abuse of public resources and abuse of public power in order to pursue something that truly, whose point at this juncture is very unclear. And with that, I'm
Chairwoman, my friend, Mr. Westerman, just a couple quick questions. The ranking members talked about somehow this is good for, individuals who are, quote, polluters. I know at least one of the bills we're talking about is important with respect to the Duluth complex, right? And that would, it could constitute a sizable portion. I've got 88% down in my notes, but I know it's a very large percent of the cobalt reserves in the United States. Currently, we're highly dependent on China for cobalt, correct?
Very dependent on China for cobalt and many other minerals and rare earth elements.
And is it not true that the Biden administration, with its senseless, job-killing, hard-working, American, life-destroying tailpipe rule that will stack up more mandates on electric vehicle production to the tune of something like 2/3 of the production by 2030, that meanwhile EVs are piling up on the lots of automobile dealerships across the country, that in light of that even if one were to say that we should be moving towards electric vehicles, which I think is a reasonable question to debate in and of itself, would it not be foolish to do that on the back of Chinese production and Chinese cobalt mining?
I believe so, and I think you've done a great job of outlining what I would call Democrat utopia. We're going to have our cake and eat it too. We're going to get rid of fossil fuel. We're going to get rid of internal combustion engine vehicles. Everybody's going to drive an EV, and we're not going to mine anything to create the components that go into that EV, or to strengthening the grid, or to building wind and solar and more distributed electrical systems. And it just doesn't work that way. It's a not in my backyard mentality that is forcing our supply chains more and more to China, who has gone out and hoarded resources from around the world. Cobalt is one you mentioned that comes from the Congo, where
Right.
they use child slave labor.
Child slave labor, right?
They haul it back to China, where they refine it. And by the way, China built 50 gigawatts of coal-powered plants last year. That's one every 5 days, so they can process the minerals and manufacture the stuff to sell to us so that we can save the planet. It makes absolutely no sense.
Representative Ocasio-Cortez, what do you say to that point, right? When we've got a significant amount of evidence that China owns the vast majority, if not all, 80% plus of the cobalt mine production coming out of Congo, et cetera. And we know, I think it's irrefuted, that there's child labor exploited to get those minerals. Those minerals are central, if not fully necessary, for the production of EVs, which even objectively we have to acknowledge are not fully able to power the ability of the American public to get to their jobs and their work and so forth. And yet we're mandating that we have 2/3 of the production be EVs by 2030. So if we follow those mandates by the Biden administration, that debate aside, right? Debate for a different day. If you follow those mandates, you got to have a massive, massive amount of battery production. And by all indication, the vast majority of that Congo production is controlled by China. A huge amount of that has child labor and other issues that we've talked about. And you got trafficked child slaves that are reported in the production of it. Why on earth would we want to limit the ability of Americans to go mine cobalt? Now, I might say, well, that's kind of great because I actually still want the internal combustion engine. I actually think it's more affordable and better for the American worker who wants the plumber in San Marcos, Texas, to be able to go to work and afford the car. But if you buy into the motion of having, EVs that you can drive all over creation, even if you're from Texas and you had to do like I did, I appreciate the chairman pointing out the passing of my grandma. I had to drive 6 hours, like 300 miles to go see my grandma Thursday before she passed away, and 6 hours back. I couldn't do that at an EV. I wouldn't have been able to make the round trip in time. But okay, assume we were able to ever produce the batteries that last long enough, the charging stations, all the stuff. Why would we get rid of the American production of it?
Thank you. There are several different components to your question. I want to make sure that I address them. First and foremost, on the issue of child exploitation, child labor, I think it is the role of the United States for us to push back forcefully on this production, and not just in the production of energy, but across the board. We see this in textile production, energy production, cobalt mining. It is horrific, and we need to make sure that our sources do not include child labor. But to get to the core of the question, too, on the China front, is that I find it interesting that there is this concern about Chinese ownership of minerals, and it is legitimate. However, the response to that seems to be deregulation specifically for companies that are largely Chinese-owned here in the United States. These companies are subsidiaries where the benefit of what we are deregulating here, and I'll give you a specific example. I would be remiss not to mention that the minerals produced specifically at the proposed Twin Metals mine that is implicated in this legislation would most likely be shipped to China for refining and smelting to be sold on the global market. These are not American-owned companies that American mined minerals would be going to. And so if your concern is the Chinese predominance of ownership in the mining market, I would be very concerned about passing this legislation. So that, I think, on the China piece there. And lastly, on the meeting our targets and mining cobalt. I think it's a false choice to say that in order for us to mine cobalt, we either have to destroy some of the most sacred lands in the United States or rely on child labor. There's responsible mining in the United States that is available to us. But secondly, I also find it interesting that the majority presently pushes back against battery recycling, which would allow us to open the path to reducing our reliance on mining in general. There is enormous potential in recycling many of these EV batteries, but we have not made the investments or the shifts necessary in order to unlock that so that we can reduce our reliance on solely mining as the only source of battery. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Before I give my colleague a chance to respond, as I think he probably wishes to, I would only note that happy to have a conversation about restricting Chinese ownership of any number of corporate activities in the United States, or ownership of farmland, or ownership of land near military bases, or frankly, ownership of meat packing, production, including mineral production and so forth. A significant reason why it would be mined here and shipped back is because they've got all the production facilities, because they've been building and mining these, because they've got the resources to do that. And here we've got the God-given benefit in America being able to produce very clean burning natural gas, very efficient ability to have automobiles that have an internal combustion engine, which are basically fractionally about a 1.5% of the CO2 production when you compare it to what we're producing in China, as the gentleman noted, where they've got 1,100 coal-fired plants burning in China, and we have 250, and they're building 2 a week, and we're building none. And yet we're building no nuclear plants except for the Georgia plant that was finally put online 45 years after it was permitted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I think if we're going to be serious about it, we can't say, I just don't accept the premise that the sort of general notion of, well, we got to push back on the child labor. Well, I mean, we're going to use that child labor unless we find a supply right now, because the Biden administration has put their foot on the gas to say we must have EVs in 2030 at the extent of 2/3 of our entire production line. So Toyota is not a Chinese-owned company, but Toyota has a massive production facility in San Antonio, tells me that they will largely have to put their entire assembly line starting next year into EVs pretty much only, because they can't financially afford to do otherwise with these mandates on the tailpipe rule, which will be shutting down the internal combustion engine production of the Toyota vehicles. No Chinese ownership there, because that's where they are, which will then mandate the EVs, driving up the price of those vehicles, and then they got to go figure out how to get the batteries and get the production. I know the gentleman seemed like he wanted to jump in on that, and so I'd like to give him a chance to respond.
I appreciate the opportunity to respond. So many things to talk about here, and I agree with the assertion that we don't have the refining and the smelting capacity in the U.S., but that's self-imposed. You go back to 1995, we produced 3 times the copper of China, and today they produce 11 times more copper than us. They have 50 smelters, and we have 2. That's another area of regulation that's forced business like that out of our country to China, and they're making the things that we need. We're exporting wealth to China to build these projects, and we have the resources that have made this country strong and that are still here to make us strong in the future if we will just use them.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman. I will, in the interest of time, yield back. I know there's other issues here. I would just push back on the general notion that these aren't important pieces of legislation. I mean, dealing with figuring out how we're going to protect our federal lands and the wildlife and the ability for hunters and anglers to use them, all that stuff are all part of this legislation, and we all share an interest in conservation in that respect. Look at Texas. We have very little federal ownership of the land, happily so. But where we have federal lands, we ought to try to manage it appropriately for good stewardship for multiple generations, including production and AMWR, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the footprint of the entire state of Alaska. Lots of studies about wildlife benefits and so forth. But we'll put that aside for a different day, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am very concerned that these bills are a huge step back for our environment and our endangered species. They seem to be predicated on a false kind of a binary choice. And I don't think it's true that President Biden or Democrats or the American people have any interest in having a blanket prohibition on development, but we do want a system that fairly takes into account public safety, conservation, and the damage to our environment and our children's future if we aren't taking those into consideration. So can you comment on that?
Absolutely, Representative Scanlon. As you noted, particularly in the public land rule, specifically, this shift in the rule is not even to put conservation and restoration above, energy production, recreation, or any other considerations. It's simply to allow the consideration to be on equal footing. And I would emphatically push back on the notion that conservation is just simply cordoning off, that this rule is just about conservation and cordoning off several acres of land and saying there's nothing to be done here. But this is also about land restoration. And there are so many acres of land, federal lands, public lands. This is land that belongs to the people of the United States of America, that has been dumped on, that has been allowed to be overridden with toxic waste, that people are getting sick from, that species are becoming endangered from. And to allow that to simply be in equal consideration as the federal government and the Bureau of Land Management doles out and makes decisions, oftentimes affirmatively about energy production, I think is eminently reasonable.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that we're trying to balance some competing concerns, but that we really do need to take into account these conservation concerns. So I would yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just be quick. I mean, I'm thankful for the legislation on the supports hunters and fishermen. I mean, I think, the more time a child spends.
I got one too, but I'm going to let you go first.
Oh, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Unanimous consent for 100, please, Mr. Chairman. Since it has been suggested erroneously that the Secretary failed to consult with Alaska Natives, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a document outlining DOI's extensive engagement and consultation with North Slope local governments, Alaska Native corporations, and tribal entities regarding the NPRA rule.
Without objection.
Thank you.
I also have a unanimous consent request. This is an article from the New York Post titled City Hall Vows to Probe Lawlessness Following Post Report on Spiking Crime Around Floyd Bennett Field Migrant Shelter. It says, according to NYPD data, theft, robbery, and petty larceny are all increased in the 63rd Precinct, which includes the former federal airfield between November 27th and January 7th, the first several weeks of migrants being housed at the massive tent city. Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, for 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. New York Post and Congressional Record. Can't believe it. I want to return a little bit to one of the question lines that we saw earlier, Madam Secretary, and I want to clarify a few things. You are the Secretary of the Interior, correct? You are not the Secretary of Homeland Security, correct? The jurisdiction for border enforcement largely falls under the Secretary of Homeland's department. Is that correct?
That is my understanding.
And I think it is profoundly unfair of a line of attack to come in for explicitly targeting a secretary whose jurisdiction is legally bound for not being nominated to a different department. And I think it's profoundly important that we have clarity here on the jurisdiction of the Interior. I also find it very odd that there seems to be this push for you to be coordinating with Secretary Mayorkas when the Republican majority has voted to impeach Secretary Mayorkas on no evidence, with no allegation of a specific crime. And yet, if their allegation is that this is a reckless individual, they also seem to be alleging here that you should somehow be responsible for working with that. So that to me also I find to make no sense, and also cuts to the core of what this whole immigration thing is about here, which is unfortunately not a solution, but politics. And it's about not making sure that we solve this issue, not providing a path to citizenship, not ensuring that we are providing resources to judges to adjudicate these cases, but to continue to restrict the resources and policies necessary so that there continues to be a problem, so that it can continue to run a news cycle. We are better than this. Secretary Haaland, I'm gonna say it because I think it's important too. You are the first Native cabinet secretary in the history of the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, Congresswoman.
Let alone the first indigenous woman to ever serve as a cabinet secretary in the history of the United States from either party. Is that correct?
Yes, Congresswoman.
I find the notion or the suggestion, and it's not just because of your identity, it is because of your record. Your record. The insinuation that you do not care for, or the insinuation that you are not extraordinarily attentive to tribal issues, to be deeply offensive. It is deeply, deeply offensive. And you are not in a position to speak up for yourself because you are an eminent professional, and I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it. Because this woman has served on this dais too, and I had a front row seat to how she advocated for Native communities here in the United States Congress too. And the insinuation that that is somehow not central to her mission here is just completely unsubstantiated. And that's a line that we should not cross. It's just not. Tribal consultation is very important, and it is fraught. Different tribes have different standards for consultation. Is that correct, Secretary Holland?
Yes, Congresswoman. No tribe is a monolith. Tribes are not. They're in different areas of the country. They're all going to have different experiences and advocate for different things.
And so it is extraordinarily challenging when we have such a great diversity of our tribal communities in this country to meet all these different standards of consultation. But the Department of Interior has taken historic measures to meet everyone where they are at. Is that correct? Is that a fair assessment to make?
Congresswoman, when we first got into office, I'll just point out that we had a consultation on tribal consultations. We got tribes together to ask them, what's the best way for us to meet you where you are? And so we take that information and it helps us, guide us through how we do consultations for various issues. Through the various bureaus and offices, but also in general for Indian country.
Thank you very much, Secretary Holland. And while I am sure that there are places where we always can improve, and there are places where we can always make sure that we meet people better, I want us to be very mindful about the individual that we are speaking to here, and to make sure that we're doing that with respect. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, the chair of the Subcommittee on Public Lands, Mr. Tiffany.
Does any other member seek recognition?
Mr.
Chair
Chairman,
recognizes Ms. Green.
I'd like to know if any of the Democrats on this committee are employing Judge Merchan's daughter.
Please tell me what that has to do with Merrick Garland.
Is she a porn star?
Oh, Goldman. That's right. He's advising. Okay.
He's advising who? What? Do you know what we're here for? You know we're here about AG.
I don't think you know what you're here for.
Well, you the one talking about.
I think your fake eyelashes are messing up.
No,
what you're
ain't
reading.
nothing.
Hold on.
Listen.
Order.
Mr. Chairman,
That's beneath
would
even
you
you,
please
Ms. Green.
regain
That's beneath
order
even
of your
you.
committee?
Order.
Please.
There's a point of order.
We have a point of order. Mr. Lynch, state your point.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to ask the parliamentarian if your conduct here in raising money in connection with this hearing is referable to the Ethics Committee within this hearing. Is a motion in order to refer your conduct and your abuse of
It's not a point of order.
I do have a point of order, and I would like to move to take down Ms. Green's words. That is absolutely unacceptable. How dare you attack the physical appearance of another person?
Are your feelings hurt?
Her words down.
Aw.
Oh, girl, baby girl.
Oh, really?
Don't even play.
Baby girl? I don't think
we are going to move, and we're going to take your words down.
I second that motion.
So who will have to pay? Okay. All right. We're suspending.
Absolutely.
The committee will reconvene. Ms. Green has 4 minutes and 21 seconds. There's a motion Ms. Green, do you wish to strike your words?
I have 4 minutes and 21 seconds to speak.
I think we have to do the motion first, and then unless there's another motion, then you'll be recognized again. But I believe there's another motion coming. So, do you agree to strike your words?
Yeah. I'll
Okay.
agree.
Ms. Green agrees to strike her words.
I believe she
Chair
must apologize.
recognizes
No,
Mr.
no, she must
Perry.
apologize.
Okay, hold on. Then after Mr. Perry's going to be recognized, then Ms. Green
I'm
still
not
has 4 minutes and
apologizing.
21
Well,
seconds.
then
Okay,
you're
reserve
not
the right to
striking your
object.
words.
I am
Mr.
not
Perry.
apologizing.
Now let's go. Come on, guys.
Why don't you debate me?
Mr. Chairman.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Good afternoon. So I wanted to just start off right at the top because there was some breaking news just as we were filling out here today. I want to make sure that we update everybody on there. The trial for former President Trump just concluded, and the jury just delivered their verdict. So for those of you who have not been informed yet, he has been found guilty on all 34 counts. I think it does say something that this happened in New York, where he was born, where he's from, where he has operated. A lot of people who worked in construction, who have been, or who, grew up here in the city, knew that he had been involved in these kinds of practices for a very long time. And there was just kind of a lot of folks, everyday people, that have been fleeced and swindled, and I think overall this is about our justice system. It's important to note that despite the initial statements trying to politicize this verdict, saying that it was somehow partisan or Democrats or what have you, Donald Trump was convicted by a jury of his peers. His peers that were people here in New York, his defense attorneys, and both sides have the opportunity to screen who the people who serve on that jury are for partisanship. So these jurors were folks that even his own team and his own legal team helped be a part of that kind of initial screening process. This is our justice system. It is a justice system that, for the most part, does not even administer justice equally to all New Yorkers. In fact, usually it is the poorest and the people with least resources and the most marginalized, and often Black and brown New Yorkers that experience the actual miscarriages of justice, not just in New York, but across the country. And I think what was important today is trying to at least strive for a world where the rule of law applies to everybody. And in fact, usually it is the wealthiest and the whitest and the most powerful people that do not experience an actual accountability or an equal level of accountability in our justice system. And so he has the right, I think, to pursue whatever his legal avenues are, but at the end of the day, this was actually not a political process and not a partisan one. It is one of our legal and justice system that, in fact, he attempted to try to influence through political intimidation, through bullying these judges, and also, I think, active intimidation of those jurors. So I commend everyone who participated, from the jurors to the judge and everybody, for trying to stave off a lot of the intimidation of that process. And that's the result that we have today. So there we are on that. Thank you. Now, of course, we did not time this town hall to happen just 30 minutes after the verdict came out. So we have a lot to catch up on, actually, and some of the work that we've been doing in Washington. But I'd be happy to take some of your questions afterwards. But there's been a lot. Civil rights. We fought to end segregation, discrimination, and advance measures towards an integrated, diverse, multiracial society. And throughout our history, we have also had to confront the ugly legacy and backlash of bigotry, ignorance, and white nationalism. The arguments that protections and civil rights for historically marginalized populations as quote-unquote reverse racism or preferential is not new. We passed the Civil Rights Act and Economic Opportunity Act in 1964. The United States passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and spent decades afterwards integrating schools, all in an effort to build a society where people can work and be treated equally, no matter their race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. But throughout it all, from Little Rock to Charlottesville to today, extremists have resisted these efforts to integrate American democracy. They weaponize fear and claim these efforts towards a better society are themselves unjust, unconstitutional, or illegal. Today's hearing is just the latest in a decades-long attack from right-wing extremists on any and all efforts to expand civil rights, equity, and freedom in the United States. Let's start with the Civil Rights Act, which is designed to ensure no person is discriminated against for something as simple as the color of their skin, their gender, or their religion. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was even passed, conservative anti-integrationists opposed it, arguing that the law would somehow violate their constitutional right to segregated spaces. But they lost that fight. And thanks to the landmark legislation of the 1960s, opportunities for Black Americans radically expanded. From 1959 to 1969, the poverty rate for Black Americans dropped nearly in half. The share of Black youth completing high school rose from 39% to 56%, and the gap between white and Black incomes reached the lowest it had ever been, all after integrationist pro-civil rights policies were passed. Then came the conservative response afterwards. In the late 60s, Republican President Richard Nixon, determined to gain support from Southern white politicians by appealing to racism, promised to slow civil rights enforcement. In the 1970s, right-wing opponents of civil rights and integration started framing efforts to ensure all Americans have equal access to opportunities as, quote-unquote, reverse racism. And in the 1980s, Republicans and right-wing judges, including now Chief Justice John Roberts, built on that framing to advance a dubious argument. If we don't talk about bigotry, it doesn't exist. So instead of punishing bigoted leaders and organizations and societal structures in violation of the law, and working to create a more equitable world, the law would instead pretend race and racism and their real-world impacts didn't exist. This right-wing legal effort continues today. One lawyer alone, Edward Blum, backed by wealthy right-wingers, has brought more than 24 cases since the 1990s attempting to remove consideration of race entirely from key civil rights laws. This resistance to integration in every part of society, whether it be in schools or housing or the workforce, is an attempt to destroy the progress we have made toward a more equal and just society. But it's also an economic play, and that's what's important for people to understand. This is a way to keep the status quo that gives a handful of the most wealthy people in our society power and immunity, and distract the working class from attaining the basic rights and protections we all deserve. These right-wing billionaires prey on racism, bigotry, anti-trans panic, and fear to drive wedges in our communities and prevent resources from going to public services that predominantly serve working class communities. They use these arguments to defund our schools, to defund our communities, and to defund our public infrastructure. They divide us, and they dismantle our public housing, and they union bust. And let's be clear, these extremists are not just destroying the public institutions that working people rely upon as retaliation in some culture war. No, defunding services for working people is the point. And we've seen what happens when they pursue this goal. Last year alone, more than 4,200 books were targeted in right-wing attempts for censorship, most often targeted for censorship were those books that cover themes related to race, gender, and sexual orientation. Last year, a record 510 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced in state legislatures. And since the Dobbs decision 2 years ago this week, 21 states now ban abortion or are more restrictive than the standard was in place under Roe. Those opposed to integration see all of this as a victory, and they are not planning to stop there. Project 2025, the radical right-wing playbook detailing conservative Donald Trump's agenda for a second term, devotes an entire chapter to detailing the many ways that the federal government should roll back progress and turn back the clock on civil rights and liberties in the first place. I will note that the majority of this committee has apparently invited the author of that chapter to testify here today. This hearing is fundamentally an insult to the promise of a multiracial democracy that we all represent and require for prosperity for a working-class America. This hearing is fundamentally an insult to all of us. My Republican colleagues are going to say empty words about discrimination in the workplace today. They're going to play on fear and provide yet another opportunity for radical right-wing extremism, the kind that says if you're not white or cisgender or straight or a man, you don't deserve equal rights, protections over your own body, and the ability to have control over your own life to take root. But we're not going to fall for it, and we're not going to let them get away with it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Today we are joined by the Honorable Todd Rokita, who serves as the Chief Legal Officer of the state of Indiana as their Attorney General. He previously served Indiana's fourth.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Wiley, I found some of the opening statements quite interesting that we heard from our witnesses here today. Plenty of claims being thrown out there. One I thought that was particularly interesting was the idea that a company, a large company, perhaps a company like Disney or any other employer, aspiring to maybe have about 30% of new hires and having a goal of 30% of new hires being from diverse backgrounds or people of color. And the assertion that that kind of goal was anti-white discrimination. I wanted to break things down in terms of the numbers a little bit. About what percentage of Americans are white, non-Hispanic white? I think we're hearing from the census, is it like 59, 60%? Is that right?
That is about right, yes.
Okay, so about 59% of every American, of all Americans, are white. That would mean about 40% of people are people of color of the U.S. population. And it seems to be that the argument is that seeking to have 30% of your hires be people of color is anti-white discrimination. Can you shed some light on the logic of that for me, please?
No, because that's not logical. What I can say is what is factually accurate around the state of our laws, and that is aspirations are not unconstitutional. Aspirations are not antithetical or in any way a violation of Title VII under our court's precedents or based on the plain language of Title VII. And in fact, this is exactly what the fear-mongering is doing. We know, for example, that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had 1 million complaints between 2010 and 2018. 1 million complaints. Anybody can file one. A white man who's experiencing discrimination on the job can file one, and it will be investigated. That is the job of the EEOC. What we're hearing and seeing is a large swath of cases that are based on race that are people of color, that are women of all races. In fact, the majority of hostile environment harassment cases are disproportionately women of all races, and black women in particular, and that's in the statistics that they provide on the website. I think the question here isn't whether people can file complaints and charges with the EEOC, it's who is filing them and why. And the aspirations themselves are consistent with our goals.
Very well said. Thank you. And I find that point so interesting and fascinating because with all of this discussion around how diversity, equity, and inclusion policies are discriminatory in the long history of anti-integration in this country and reaction and opposition to the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and more, I think one of the things that we need to take a look at is the world that they're fighting for, a world without diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, which is to say the default, which is to say workplaces that are honestly kind of like Congress, because the population of the United States, as we mentioned, is about 59% white. Do you know what percentage of Congress is white?
I don't, but I know that we finally have 60 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, which is progress.
But even then, 75%. White Americans make up 60%, 59% of the US population, 75% of Congress. Men are 50% of the population and make about 70% of Congress. When we see institutions of power, when we see, and that is reflected in almost any institutional organization of power, and when we even just try to have the basic acknowledgement that it would be good to encourage not an unreflective body, not unreflective workforce, but a workforce that barely even reaches the proportion of representation of what everyday Americans look like. That's somehow anti-white discrimination, anti-male discrimination, anti-straight discrimination, anti-cisgender discrimination. I mean, come on, folks. What are we doing here? What are we doing here? And lastly, Ms. Wiley, I was wondering if you could also just shed some light on the economic impact of civil rights legislation, and if you could draw that link between civil rights protections and policies and outcomes that help the working class.
Yeah, one of the critical things we have seen as a result of having civil rights protections and having them enforced is we have seen an increase in participation and people getting to the middle class of the American country, particularly people of color, long denied fair and equal opportunities. And I think it's really important to understand that that has had widespread societal benefits. For example, thanks to civil rights laws, we have seen an increase in the life expectancy of people who are black, and not only black, other people of color, and that's something we all want. One of the things that's so important to understand about the Sheets case, because we keep hearing about this, and it is being misrepresented. What the Sheets case says isn't you have to hire any old body who's a person of color, no matter their criminal background. It's saying you can't use what is colorblind on its face, but has the practical effect of denying employment if it does not bear a relationship to the job that is going to be done. You can absolutely say an accountant who has been convicted of absconding with money, you don't have to hire that person. The reason that the Sheets case is a lawsuit is because they didn't have evidence that they needed to do that, and it was discriminating against qualified black applicants.
Very good. Chair now recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. We've heard a lot today. I'd like to bring this conversation a little bit down to earth and make it more about the people that we're here to serve. I'm the Congresswoman for the Bronx and Queens. I represent a community that has some of the highest childhood asthma rates in the United States. And when we hear this conversation about how regulations threaten economic prosperity, and I jotted it down earlier because I couldn't even believe that I heard it, that economic prosperity, quote, is the #1 driver of clean air and clean water, as though our rivers were somehow, I mean, our rivers and forests were clean and unpolluted before a single factory was constructed in this country. That is the state of nature. I want us to be clear about that. Now, when we hear people use this term economic prosperity, I want folks to know at home what that is a shadow screen for is a term otherwise known as profit. Wall Street profit, very often. And Administrator Regan, you've been accused of sabotaging here the economic prosperity of this country for enforcing and introducing regulations about chemicals that this committee itself has investigated, such as PFAS. I'd like for us to dig into that a little bit. PFAS is a chemical byproduct of, and it's a chemical that's in almost everything. Teflon pans, workout gear, fire extinguisher foam. What are some of the health consequences that we have seen as a result of elevated levels of PFAS for everyday Americans?
Well, you know, they range from various types of cancers, death. These carcinogenic elements are wreaking havoc on communities all across the country.
We've had people from PFAS-affected, especially PFAS-affected communities, that have had fertility issues. Is that correct?
Yes.
Testicular cancer.
Yes.
Is that correct? Developmental delays in children. Is that consistent with what you've seen?
Yes.
Thyroid issues, increased risk of cancer. Correct?
Yes.
And those people, those kids, those parents who are struggling to conceive now, that's who we respond to. That's who we answer to. Correct, Administrator Regan?
Absolutely.
The American people. Now, I want to name something. This isn't just economic prosperity. There are people and organizations and companies responsible for this. DuPont and 3M are two of the largest corporations that were responsible for PFAS dumping in the United States. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did they know that these chemicals were potentially toxic? Is that correct?
We believe they did.
And yet, there are members here of this committee that want to defend the quote-unquote economic right for a company to poison its people, the American people. Now, when we talk about economic prosperity, if you're a kid in the South Bronx, if you are a mom in rural Pennsylvania near a PFAS dumping site, who comes ahead when you get cancer and have a medical bill to pay? Who comes out ahead from that PFAS dumping? The CEO of DuPont or that mom? So when we talk about the bills and the prosperity that gets made from here and who has to pay that, we need to understand a very simple economic concept called externalities. Externalities. The costs of pollution, the cost of poisoning that are not factored into the profit margin of the corporation that's actually wreaking havoc on this planet. And when we talk about issues like climate change, it is at its core an issue of externalities. Because ExxonMobil and all of these oil companies can afford to burn this planet to a crisp because it makes them a pile of money. Now, Administrator Regan, I want to thank you because in the character attacks that you have experienced in this hearing, I know that you have spent your entire time and your entire federal service
Your time is
protecting
up. I
families
appreciate it
from
this
being
morning.
poisoned.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right.
I mean, they can't help themselves, right? I think this is a result of, you know, when you are used to or are a party of largely one gender and one identity, and also lots of political families and dynasties, sometimes it feels like people who've earned their spot are a threat to the people who have really benefited from a lot of privilege in having their spot. And so their attempt at doing that is saying anybody who, you know, has rightfully earned their place here is DEI. I call it working your off.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that, right? We all recognize what people mean when they say DEI now, right? And it has become a safe way of basically using a racial slur against black folks, not just black folks, but particularly black folks. So I'm not surprised. We have seen this type of rhetoric from this caucus for some time, obviously dating back to Barack Obama and the very unfair things that they've said about him. We've seen the imagery that people are willing to use. We've seen, and if any of you live on Twitter, X, whatever it's called now, you have seen the harassment that black members of our elected bodies and regular black folks have to deal with, the harassment, the incessant name calling. That's our reality now. So, I mean, I think on one hand, maybe the most surprising part of that is that he's actually asking his caucus to cease that. I hope that they will continue that stance. I hope that they will be very vocal about that. And I also hope that when they see it, they will nip it in the bud and they will call it what it is.
Polls closing tonight. Okay? On the other end, there are plenty of other issues that are people's number one issues: healthcare, education, gun safety, etc. And we also have to make sure that we're continuing to advocate on substance and engage on substance as well. But I know for me, I think that we got to have our eyes on the prize, and we don't get progress on anything if Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are within any shot of the presidency in November. They cannot be allowed within any sort of radius of entering the White House as a president or vice president-elect. Point blank, period. Because let me tell you something, even as disappointed as one may be, because like our system of governance is highly flawed, and also, like, yes, lobbyists buy, and corporate lobbies buy enormous influence in Washington. We see it every day up close. We see corruption up close, and it is easy to get cynical and jaded and say, you know what, I'm going to tap out. But you know what? There's actually no reason to tap out, because now we have everybody from Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley and Ilhan Omar and myself in the House holding down positions and hoping to expand those positions, as we have with amazing people like Summer Lee and Delia Ramirez and Greg Casar and Maxwell Frost, and we're growing those ranks. But then also, we have a real fight at the top of the ticket that is worth fighting for. And no one can tell me that Donald Trump is somehow the same as the Democratic ticket in any way, shape, or form. Try telling that to a trans kid in Tennessee, that whose president is gonna be the same. I'll tell you, it's gonna be really, really different. And we have an obligation to stand in solidarity. Tell that to a woman who's bleeding out in an ER in potentially Missouri or in another state that doesn't guarantee the same abortion rights and the same rights to reproductive justice and care that they do in other states. This isn't a game. It's not a game. And this is, in many ways, and for many people, an election of life and death. And that's not hyperbole. You see J.D. Vance talking about how he wants access and how his record shows that he wants access to track women's cycles. What do you want that information for, bud? What do you want that information for? And then he's out here saying creepy stuff, saying like because I don't have a child presently, that because I don't have a child presently, that my right to vote should be diluted. What is that? What is that? It's creepy. It's weird. He tried to walk it back too by being like, oh, I don't think we should punish people who biologically can't have a kid. How do you know? How do you know? This is that boneheaded, like, don't know the first thing about a woman's body type of nonsense that should not be allowed within a 10-foot pole of the White House, okay? Because if you don't know 50% of the U.S. population, you don't know jack, all right? That's what you got, J.D. Vance. Thank you very much.
Chicago
We have to help her win. Because we know that Donald Trump would sell this country for $1 if it meant lining his own pockets and greasing the palms of his Wall Street friends. And I, for one, am tired of hearing about how a two-bit union buster thinks of himself as more of a patriot than the woman who fights every single day to lift working people out from under the boots of greed, trampling on our way of life. The truth is, Don, you cannot love this country if you only fight for the wealthy and big business. To love this country is to fight for its people, all people, working people, everyday Americans like bartenders and factory workers and fast food cashiers who punch a clock and are on their feet all day in some of the toughest jobs out there. You know, ever since I got elected, Republicans have attacked me by saying that I should go back to bartending. But let me tell you, I'm happy to any day of the week because there is nothing wrong with working for a living.
Kamala Harris will be the next president of the United States. Now, we know, of course, many of us have heard some of what had happened at the Madison Square Garden rally. And that was right in my hometown of New York. We just came from there this morning and flew in today. And I want us to really talk about what happened there and what that experience is. Because the logic of someone like the Trump campaign and someone like Donald Trump is to try to isolate that incident, when, first of all, they knew exactly what they were doing. Let's dispense with this idea of it's just a joke, or this was someone else, or this was just a comedian. We all saw there were 2 teleprompters right there on both sides of that screen. They were loaded with words. And it wasn't just about the fact that Donald Trump rallied tens of thousands of people, of Americans, to rally and froth behind words like calling Puerto Rico a floating pile of garbage, saying absolutely horrific things about Latino Americans, saying horrific things about women that he has said, about how he moves on them and how he touches them and what he's been convicted, or rather what he's been found liable for in a court of law. But the reason they do this is because they are preying on us not seeing ourselves in each other. They want us to think that he's not talking about me. He's talking about some other. It's the same kind of logic that says a Puerto Rican girl from the Bronx has no business connecting with a community in Madison, Wisconsin. But I have a message for individuals that operate on that logic, that the identity of our country is so much deeper than the division they seek to stoke between us. Every day, when I walk into our nation's capital and I step foot on the floor of the United States House of Representatives alongside your incredible Congressman, Mark Pocan, we walk through those hollowed doors and see emblazoned on the floor of the People's House, one phrase, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. They want us to think that it's the other way around, that there is many and there is no one. There's no unity in this country. Because if we do not see that ourselves and others, then they can divide us so that they can sell our country for parts to the highest bidder and the billionaire that wants to buy us out. And we're not going to let them do that. We're not going to let them do that. We cannot let them do that. And so when we hear an individual, like whether it's Donald Trump or one of his cronies on a stage, talking about our fellow Americans as a pile of garbage, know that he's talking about us. He's talking about you. When he calls our service members and our veterans suckers and losers, he is talking about us. He's talking about you. When he talks on how he moved on young women like they were a B word, he's talking about all of us. All of us. When he pursues that, and it's very important for us to understand that racism is not a name or an insult. It is a descriptor of a belief system. It's a descriptor of a belief system. And Donald Trump believes that Americans are not created equal. He believes, and the people that he puts in power, like Stephen Miller, they believe that U.S. citizens are not created equal. So when they go on a stage and echo the words of Adolf Hitler, this is real life. This is real life. When he goes up on a stage and the people that he wants to appoint as leadership heads in administration, and they echo the words of Adolf Hitler, in America for Americans. No, he's not talking about U.S. citizens. He's talking about who he believes is loyal enough to Donald Trump, and that's who he considers an American. We cannot let this happen to our country. We must defend our nation, and that is what we do when we knock on our neighbor's door. Because the way that we defend our nation is by seeing ourselves in others, in understanding that he is not exempting us when he talks about the way he talks about undocumented people, or the way he talks about the poor, or the way he talks about people who live in cities or in suburbs, or women or LGBT people. He is talking about us. When he talks about trans people, he's talking about us. When he uses these descriptors as trying to make us believe that, oh, that's not me he's talking about, it is you he's talking about. It's everyone less than him that he's talking about. It's Americans that he's talking about. It's our Constitution that he's trampling and tearing up. It's our Bill of Rights that he is disrespecting. It is the foundation of America that is under attack. And the way that we do it is and the way we overcome that is by coming together. It's by coming together. But I don't mean to say that in a superficial sense about how we come together. This isn't just about coming around a campfire. This is about coming together for an affirmative vision for the future of the United States of America. It's about the vision and what we want to come together for, not just what we seek to oppose and what we're against.
I hope that thing's filled with brains. This could be amazing. I yield back.
Is that a request to have Mr. Bentz duck when you're talking? The gentleman's time has expired. The chair.
Without objection. Mr. Chairman, may I ask for a unanimous consent request, please? Since Mr.
Sure.
Graves has invited it, I think this is probably a good time to enter all 920 pages of of Trump's Project 2025 into the record, where you can see on page 61, for example, the call for giving project proponents more control over regulatory clocks, page 524, for example, which rescinds the Biden rules and reinstates Trump rules under CEQ reforms. For NEPA, page 533, for example, where the Department of Interior is mandated to reinstate secretarial orders under the Trump administration, including time and page limits on NEPA documents. Page 533, for example, where consideration of eliminating judicial review and the challenges to the adequacy of NEPA documents, it goes on, and I would request unanimous
Reserving the
consent.
right to object.
I object also.
Reserving the right to object. Mr. Chairman, I have a question. How many trees would it take to print that? I'm just.
And they didn't even print the secret fourth pillar that's their radical emergency orders for the first 180 days. It's a great question.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think President Trump and his campaign has denied any dealings with 2025. Last night he said in the debate that he never has read it, nor does he want to read it. So to say
But he says
that
some
is
parts
Trump,
are good.
Excuse me, I've got the floor. To say that this is his project, I think is wrong, and it's wrong to enter it into the records.
Mr. Chairman, this is about this committee, not even waiting for Donald Trump, actually proceeding now to implement parts of Project 2025. I can't imagine anything more relevant given the subject matter of this hearing, so I will request unanimous consent to enter it into the record so we can demystify this for Mr. Graves and others who seem to think that there's not a direct line.
So is there objection to entering the 2025 report that is not the Trump report as stated by Mr. Huffman?
Just written by Trump's complete inner circle, but yes.
Yes. There is objection. Moving right along, the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, for 5 minutes.
I must say, I find that surprising. Rarely in the history of this committee or any other have I seen an objection to unanimous consent report for documents regardless of party submitting to it. I do not object to Republican submissions as opposed, personally opposed as I am to them on their grounds, including when I think they're factually incorrect. So I find that extraordinarily disappointing. Given the fact that Representative Huffman was not allowed to submit his unanimous consent on Project 2025, perhaps we should talk about it a little bit more. President Trump denied association with it last night. He also said a lot of other things. He talked about eating pets and transgender operations on migrants in prisons, and he talked about being the leader of fertilization. I mean, his denial doesn't really carry much weight here. The fact of the matter is that the Heritage Foundation, which has drafted Project 2025, has had a history documented of extraordinary influence over the Trump administration, including those individuals that were part of his administration, as well as the broader agenda of the Republican Party, which is what we're seeing play out here today. Project 2025 threatens to completely overturn abortion rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, civil liberties, free speech, and environmental protections for everyday Americans who deserve the right to clean air and clean water and to not be poisoned by the projects that are happening around them. It's no surprise that Project 2025 attacks the National Environmental Policy Act, one of our bedrock environmental laws intended to protect communities from harm and give them voice in federal decision-making. If there's a project that is going to potentially be installed next to your home that could spill cancerous chemicals and expose your kids to substances that could delay their mental and cognitive development, you would want to know. If there is a project or a fracking site that gets put in, and when you wake up in the morning, your lungs burn because there's something in the air that you can't see, you would want to know. And you would want the right to intervene and have a say in what gets put where. Mr. Beard, are you familiar with Project 2025 and its intersections with NEPA?
Yes, I am.
And just so we're clear, again, because the document was not allowed to be submitted, I will read page 60 from Project 2025. Quote, the president should instruct the Council on Environmental Quality to rewrite its regulations implementing NEPA along the lines of the 2020 effort and restoring its key provisions, such as banning the use of cumulative impact analysis, banning the use of analyzing the cumulative impact of a given project. Mr. Beard, what exactly is cumulative impact analysis? And can you briefly tell us about the Trump era 2020 regulations that they are referring to here?
Yes, that in which you're speaking of in particular addresses with Project 2025, the cumulative and environmental justice impacts, as well as the environmental justice impacts to communities like mine, communities across the country. It's important because as the climate changes and gets worse, those people are made to suffer and get the worst of the damage. With environmental justice impact, it talks about the access to being able to speak to the situations you mentioned that would affect you if something of that nature moved next door to you. But it also looks at the cumulative impacts because over time, those impacts worsen. We know the releases, we know what they're doing beforehand, but it takes time for that to materialize. And if it goes beyond 120 days, then we're stuck. So we have a problem with that. And we have to consider climate, environmental justice, and the cumulative impacts of these projects.
Thank you very much. You know, I think when we look at the broad impact of what's happening here, what we are also looking at is, especially in terms of Project 2025, is handing over all of the tools of our democracy and governance that is supposed to be wielded by the people and the public, for the people and the public, and handing those keys over directly to industry, to rewrite them however they see fit, to maximize their own pocket, to line their own pockets at the expense of the health and dignity of the American people. Profit should not drive absolutely everything. And governance is where we are here to assert the rights and protections of people when a profit incentive or a profit motive then comes at odds with people's human rights. It may be profitable to poison a community, but that's not what we're here to do. There has to be lines. And you know, again, I am disappointed, and I would like to seek unanimous consent once again to submit Project 2025 under my personal request.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Fulcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.